friends. Here we are again to share about broadening the horizons of our minds. I have this book just come out a month ago, the Broadening the Horizons of Our Minds, Reflections on Faith and Science. And in a previous talk, I explained how the Second Vatican Council wants us to broaden the horizons of our minds by reflecting on the relationship between faith and science. Faith, of course, for a Catholic comes from what the Bible teaches. But this is not in conflict with what modern science is also teaching. And so in this sharing, which I title The Bible and Science, I want to start by explaining that the Catholic Church is not in conflict with scientific theories on creation, but uses both the biblical account and scientific theories of creation. The Church accepts that the Genesis account is to be interpreted alongside science, which can give us a correct idea of how the world and the universe was created. For instance, when Pope Francis became Pope, in an audience to the plenary assembly of what is called the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, he warned that for Catholics and anyone to take the Bible Genesis account literally is dangerous. This is what he said. When we read in Genesis the account of creation, we risk imagining God as a magician with a magic wand able to make everything suddenly appear. But it is not so. He created human beings and allowed them to develop according to the internal laws that God gave to each one, so that they were able to develop and to arrive at their fullness of being. God gave autonomy. I'm continuing to share the words of Pope Francis. God gave autonomy to the beings of the universe at the same time at which He assured them of His continuous presence, that God would be guiding everything in the universe. And so creation continued for centuries and centuries, millennia and millennia, until it became what we know today. Precisely because, Pope Francis says, because God is not a conjurer, a magician, but the creator who gives being to all things. So the beginning of the world, where it says at the beginning it was all chaos, that's what Genesis says, the beginning of the world is not the work of chaos that owes its origin to some other force, but derives directly from the supreme origin that creates out of love, that is God. The Big Bang, Pope Francis says, which is posited as the origin of the world, does not contradict the divine act of creating, but rather requires it. The Big Bang requires God to start. The evolution of nature does not contrast with the notion of God creating the world, because evolution presupposes the creation of beings that evolve. So Pope Francis's statement mirrors the statement made by Pope St. John Paul II several years before, in 1996. However, these statements are not to be considered in the absence of faith and theology. So we cannot just take science and forget about faith and theology. No, the two have to go together. To consider creation and evolution without God is a fallacy, Pope John Paul II said. When contemplating creation, Pope John Paul makes it clear that individuals should not simply consider one theory, but rather theories which combine both science and faith. So you see the relevance of this topic. Broaden the horizons of their minds. We have to accept both the Bible and scientific theories. We can accept the Bible and interprets what science teaches. And science in turn can help us to interpret the Bible not literally, but according to the sense in which it was written. We believe firmly that the Bible contains the truth about God as the ultimate and only creator. We Catholics. However, there are Christians who have different views. For instance, creationists take the Bible literally. They believe the Genesis account is factually how the world was created. Now, of course, we cannot accept that, because that was not the purpose of the authors of the Bible, to tell us how the world was created. The purpose of the Bible account is to tell us that God is in control, starting from the very first moment. So let us look now a little bit in detail at the first chapter of Genesis, or first 6, 7 verses or 10 verses. Genesis chapter 1 verse 1 says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." In the beginning. Beginning of what? The beginning of everything, of time and space and matter. It's hard to even imagine. But before this amazing beginning that God gave us, there was no light, no dark, no cold, no heat, no trees or grass, not even the earth we live on, and no stars, not even a sky, nothing. So there was a beginning, a moment, which today scientists call the Big Bang, in a giant burst of energy when there was nothing. And that's why we say God created the universe out of nothing. There was nothing before. It was only God. But now, in a giant burst of energy, something like super powerful beams of light, brighter than anything our eyes can see, God created our universe. And when God says, "Let there be light," well, this is what scientists call the Big Bang. The clock begins to tick. And 13.7 billion years ago is when all this started. That was the beginning of everything. Before this, there was only God. So, science tells us that this Big Bang, with which the universe began, this universe, this Big Bang was not one moment. It is still going on. The universe is expanding. Space is actually stretching. Something like a balloon getting bigger by the rubber expanding, even though no new rubber is added. It is there in that balloon, you might say, before you start blowing into it and it becomes bigger and bigger. But the difference between space and rubber is that eventually the balloon will burst, but not space. Space, we believe, can stretch forever until that second coming of Christ, when everything will be made new. So, I don't want to go into great detail regarding how this Big Bang proceeded, because this whole question of black holes, the whole question of so many galaxies, etc., etc. But the main point to understand from the Bible is that thousands of years ago, millions, billions of years ago, there was a beginning. Sometimes we take for granted the fact that there is a universe. But if we think about it, just the fact of existence, of there being a world, is amazing. Then we come to Genesis chapter 1 verse 2. And it's, the earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God hovered over the face of the waters. Notice now, the Holy Spirit, capital S, is not known in the Old Testament. So this Spirit of God is with a small s. It means a power from God, hovered over the face of the waters. At first the universe was a tiny speck like a seed. And so the earth mentioned in this verse was without form and void. The first two verses of Genesis really tell us that God had created the raw materials out of which the heavens, the stars, the galaxies, and then the earth would be made during the 6 inverted commas days to come. Not our 24-hour days, not our calendar. This is a theological, symbolic term which for science each day is millions of years. That's how God ordained, you might say, put the power into that Big Bang so that slowly it would evolve. Okay, now let us come to another verse. As the Spirit of God hovered over the face of the waters, the universe expanded outward faster than a blink, as if a sudden magnificent puff had started to inflate a balloon. Now notice the term, the Spirit of God hovering, is never again repeated in the entire Hebrew Bible. The Spirit of God hovered, and in an incredible burst, the universe expanded outward. It grew, eventually become what we know it today, with billions of galaxies and trillions of stars. All this started as a point not larger than a grape seed. Truly amazing, and all the work of God. Ancient Hebrew did not have words for modern physics. So therefore, on day 3, only on day 3 in the book of Genesis does the word waters come to mean the water on the earth. Verse 3 says, "Then God said, 'Let there be light.' And there was light." And afterwards comes the sun. You know, this BJP minister in the time of Vajpayee, Arun Shauri, he wrote a book, The Errors of the Bible. What was the first error he pointed out? This thing about light. He says, see, the Bible says first God created light and afterwards He created the sun. And this Shauri says, what foolishness! How can you have light without the sun? You see, he is also taking the book of the Genesis literally. Of course, light comes from the sun, but this is now in our physical world. When God said, let there be light, He didn't mean let a bulb come on. This light is a symbolic word, meaning let life, let the universe, let creation begin. That's what it means. And therefore the word light symbolizes God's action, and darkness symbolizes the absence of God in the Bible. That is why St. Paul can say we are children of the light. Doesn't mean of some bulb. We are children of the light. Don't be children of the darkness. You see, it's symbolic use of words. But if you take everything literally in the Bible, then obviously Arun Shauri can make such jokes that the Bible is wrong, has mistakes in it. And then we come to another verse, verse 4. And God saw the light, that it was good, and God divided the light from the darkness. So finally, after the universe had stretched and expanded and cooled to about the temperature of the surface of our sun today, what is the temperature of the surface of our sun? 6,000 degrees centigrade. Unbelievable heat. So light was able to break free from the matter that was holding it in. The universe was then more than 1,000 times smaller and hotter than it is today at that moment of creation. That moment means billions of years. Verse 5, God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, day one. So all this is on day one. The universe, meanwhile, in this day one has continued to grow in size very quickly, but it is not yet organized. God's Spirit was shaping matter, preparing the universe for life. Natural laws were being put into it, like the law of gravity, which gives perfect order to everything in space. Light and energy were the first creations in the space of the universe. And God would use all this to form the stars, the planets, everything that would exist, even you and I. So light waves of energy are the building blocks of all matter. Again, I cannot go into physics. For instance, Einstein telling us that matter and energy are in a relationship, that matter is another form of energy, that E is equal to mc squared. All this is not meant for a talk like this. But here we certainly have to broaden the horizons of our minds and not misinterpret the Bible, not take everything literally as though the Bible is an encyclopedia of human knowledge. Not at all. The Bible is not an encyclopedia of human knowledge with perfect facts of history, geography, biology, and so on. The Bible has its own purpose. It is God's word to human beings to bring us spirit and life. That is what Jesus told us in John chapter 6, verse 63. My words, he said, are spirit and life. So don't misunderstand. We need the Bible. We can't put it aside as something outdated. But we need the Bible. We need to read that Bible and to interpret it according to the principles of interpretation which the Second Vatican Council has given us. Now we notice that the Bible mentions the sun only on day 4. Why? To make us look deeper into the meanings of the words evening and morning. You notice first is evening and then is morning. Whereas for us, when the sun rises, morning is first, then is evening. Why is this? Because the Hebrew word for evening, erev, has a root meaning of chaos. The root meaning of in Hebrew for morning, boker, is orderly, able to be recognized. So when the sun sets, vision becomes blurred. There's darkness. When the sun rises, vision becomes clear. And so by mentioning the sun on day 4, we are forced to look also for these deeper symbolic meanings of the words. Okay, now we come to verses 6 to 8. Then God said, let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters. Now again here, waters is not H2O as we understand, because the cosmology of the Bible is quite different from what we know today. Cosmology of the Bible had not yet developed, obviously. Science is a recent phenomenon. So God made the firmament and divided the waters that were under the firmament from the waters that were above. And it was so. and God called the firmament heaven. And there was evening and there was morning, a second day. So now in this second day, God uses light to form the stars and galaxies in greater numbers than we can imagine. A great cloud of gases and stardust from the ancient stars that had exploded eons ago formed our own star, the sun, and all the materials for the earth and moon, all the planets in our solar system. Great wisdom was at work as the earth was being formed perfectly for life. So remember, I started by quoting Pope Francis, who said the book of Genesis presupposes a creator, that God starts it all. But then the Big Bang and other scientific theories explain how this creation progressed. Not without God. God had put into that first initial Big Bang all the laws, all the energy, all the requirements for an orderly universe to evolve. The earth itself was just the right distance from the sun, and not close enough to be too hot, not so far as to be cold. The Creator knew that to have life we need temperature and water and air, of course. The earth and the solar system have a long list of items that allow life to form. Again, I'm not going to go into details of evolution because this is not a science class. For example, Venus, where the same surface almost always faces the sun and its back is always in the shade, probably there's no human life, of course. Human life, even any other life, we don't know yet. But from calculations, this seems to be the case. Now more and more space exploring missiles and aircraft being shot up so that we find more about the world, not just our own earth, but the whole cosmos. Then we come to verses 9 to 13, the last few verses that I comment on. Then God said, "Let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and gathering together of the waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let the earth bring forth grass, the herb that yields seed, and fruit trees that yield fruit, according to its kind." And it was so. Now you notice all this is a description in one day, but it has actually taken not just centuries, but billions of centuries. And God saw that it was good, and there was an evening, and there was morning, a third day. So the initial burst of the Big Bang creation produced the lightest of elements, hydrogen and helium. Hydrogen is excellent for making stars, but is not enough to make humans. For that we need heavier elements like carbon, oxygen, potassium, etc. In fact, life requires, you know how much? 92 natural occurring elements before life can be formed. So all these were made within the cores of the stars, and the immense pressures forced the hydrogen nuclei to fuse, and in doing so, via a few subtle transitions, formed the hydrogen, the lightest of elements, into helium, the next lightest of elements, and so on and so on. So now let us come to our solar system is made from the debris of all these events, all the primordial hydrogen left over from the Big Bang. So in time, in our corner of the universe, the rocks, the dust, the gases of one such explosion were drawn together to form the sun and the planets of the solar system. And eventually, as all this cooled, they came about our Earth. Much of the iron gravitated toward the center of the planet. Water began to condense, become liquid. Some of the water formed great oceans. Some of the water stayed in the air, in the atmosphere as clouds and fog. Very soon after water appeared on the earth, tiny one-celled creatures called bacteria and algae were formed. In wisdom, formed by whom? By God. There has to be an intelligence in this evolution. It's not chaos. What a marvel. Science is teaching us that God did not just simply say something and it happened as though by magic. Science is teaching us about the great wisdom of God and the great power of God in order to create our universe. So just as the wonder of there having been a Big Bang creation of the universe from absolutely nothing exceeds the understanding and even our imagination, so does the fact that lifeless matter, rocks and water became alive and knew how to stay alive. Never let yourself forget the wonder of our world. Never take our magnificent universe for granted. Every sight of a tree or a leaf or a tiny insect is a reminder of the marvel and the miracle of our existence. With the wisdom of creation, from the rocks and water and a few simple chemicals, the wonder of life was brought forth. So another stage, evening with its stage of disorder, chaos, darkness, gives way to morning. Until the middle of the 1970s, so last century, the accepted wisdom of random evolution was that billions of years passed during which random chemical reactions took place. But then came new discoveries, for example, of the Harvard University professor Baggon, who said that the first form of life, who discovered and proved that the first form of life, the microbes, appeared not after billions of years, but immediately after the earth cooled. So the old theory of the gradual evolution of life from non-living matter literally evaporated. And evolutionists now struggle to discover how life could have emerged from non-living matter so rapidly. It is hard to avoid reaching for a supernatural intelligence, God, as the driving force behind these new forms of life. Now, the forms of this plant life are not what we see with the naked eye. The fossil record describes a microscopic form of flora, bacteria, and algae. So before the 1970s, this was unknown. Now, with powerful microscopes and scientific investigation, they have been discovered. So let us relook at that opening words of Pope Francis. Because the Bible speaks in language that people can understand, the direct text consistently deals with aspects of life as they are directly sensible to humans. Sensible means discoverable. At the time the Bible was written, and for most of the time thereafter, till they say last century, people would not have understood the concept of living creatures that cannot be seen. So let us conclude this presentation with another description, not from Genesis now, but from cosmology by a well-known Jesuit called Father John Surette. He says, "No matter where we focus our attention in the 13.7 billion year unfolding of the universe, no matter where we focus our attention in these billions of years, we find the promise of more. M-O-R-E. There's more. We find it in the beginning and we find it in the present moment. God is always more. In its original flaring forth with the Big Bang, the universe expressed itself as plasma of charged particles and energy. The temperature of that plasma was in the order of 1,000 million degrees centigrade. 1,000 million degrees centigrade. This contained the promise of atoms. And so it happened after about 1 million years that the plasma cooled as it expanded, and the particles were drawn together, forming atoms of hydrogen and then of helium. Very quickly, the universe took the form of galactic clouds. These proto-galaxies, hundreds of billions of them, formed into existence. The galaxies held the promise of stars. And so it happened that due to the attracting force of gravity, the molecules of hydrogen and helium were drawn together where they ignited, and the primal stars burst into being. These stars, hundreds of millions of them in each galaxy, lit up the universe like a cosmic Christmas tree. One of these stars contained the promise of our own solar system. And so it happened some 5 billion years ago, mind you, not 13.7 billion years ago of the Big Bang, just 5 billion years ago, a primal star, which recently has been named Tiamat, swelled and exploded with that brilliance of 1 billion stars scattering its dust in space. Over time, that star was drawn together where it ignited and gave birth to our sun. It was from the scraps of that birth that the planets, including our beautiful planet Earth, were born. Now, the early Earth contained the promise of life. When did it happen? Some 4 billion years ago. Conditions were such that life was able to emerge within Earth's oceans in the form of tiny, one-celled creatures. For millions of years, they cleaned the waters, added oxygen to the atmosphere, prepared the way for every complex form of life that was to follow, like our own human life. That most creative and unpredictable of creatures, a human being, came about that time. The promise of more was embedded in humankind. And so it happened over the past 200,000 years that we human beings moved from being hunters and gatherers into being village and city dwellers. We also dared to dream dreams and see visions, as the Bible tells us. The old men see dreams, dream dreams, and the young men see visions. So we created language and art, literature and poetry, philosophy and theology, science and technology. And in modern times, we took into ourselves the very powers of the universe itself. The evolving universe is essentially promise. It is the fulfillment of more. More. This more is often not predictable or even imaginable. Those atoms could not have imagined that they would produce stars and galaxies. The more that the universe promises often turns out to be a total surprise. Such a universe points to an ultimate mystery that is more than we can imagine. And this mystery is God. A God who is full of surprises and who delights in change and adventure and growth. The hope invites us into our future and moves our actions into the present. And that is why today ecology has become such an important topic. The ecological ethic nurtures within us human beings an intensified sense of responsibility for the earth within which such promises are embedded. A justice that is sensitive to all creatures, that is part of this new ecology or the eco-spirituality. It makes evident to us that to contribute to the diminishment of the earth, to the destruction of the earth and its human community, is to cancel out the promise of the Maker, the promise of more. The famous Jesuit scientist Teilhard de Chardin, who actually foretold that the cosmos is evolving and finally going to reach Omega point, which is Jesus Christ is the Alpha and the Omega. In other words, it's going to end with God being the Lord of all. And every knee will bow and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. So let us never be surprised to find that within ourselves there is an endless aching need. Our hearts are restless, St. Augustine said, until they find their rest in God. So when we experience restlessness, we are participating in the promise of more that pulsates throughout the universe. An evolutionary universe encourages us to believe in a wonderfully great and good God and to trust that there is always more. So let us broaden the horizons of our minds and let us realize that faith and science are complementary. They correct each other, they enlarge, they broaden the horizons of each other. Provided, of course, for us faith comes from a Bible which we do not take literally, because that was never the purpose of the Bible's writers, to be taken literally. We have to go deep into the principles of interpretation and then realize, oh, this is what God was really saying. Praise the Lord.